Colonel Marcus "Ghost" Reeves was a man that time had forgotten. At 63 years old, with graying hair and scars that told stories of 3 decades in the skies, he was still recognized in the corridors of Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, not out of respect, but out of a kind of awkward pity. The younger pilots called him Fossil when they thought he wasn't listening. The superior officers kept him in the archives, far from the modern cockpits filled with technology that made his knowledge obsolete. His career had been glorious once. During the Gulf War, he was a legend, the pilot who brought down enemies with surgical precision, who knew every movement of the air like a maestro knows his symphony. But that was before drones, before artificial intelligence, before machines replaced human instinct. Now, Marcus spent his days analyzing old flight data in a small office in the basement, far from the runways. His job consisted of cataloging historical combat trajectories, work that nobody really valued. The base kept him like a living museum, more out of obligation than necessity. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, his children lived in other states, and the military pension he received was insufficient. He had nowhere to go. In the office next to his, Captain James Chun, a 28-year-old with an always hurried expression, rarely greeted him. Chun represented everything Marcus was not: connected, quick, incapable of staying away from a smartphone for more than 2 minutes. James was a prodigy in modern combat systems, but lacked what no manual could teach: intuition forged in true aerial battles. The morning of September 12th began like all the others. Marcus was holding his lukewarm coffee in his hands, reviewing flight data from 1991, when the alarm at the base sounded. It was not a simulation. The siren echoed with real urgency, reverberating through the concrete walls. He heard screams in the hallway, accelerated steps, doors slamming. Instinctively, Marcus moved. His generation still knew what to do when that specific siren sounded. He ran to the Situation Room, where monitoring screens showed the chaos in real time. 10 unidentified enemy fighters had entered American airspace. They were not known. They were not expected. The latest generation defense systems were failing. Those enemies flew irregularly, unpredictably, as if defying the very logic of the algorithms trying to intercept them. General Harlow, commander of the base, was red with fury. His eyes swept the room until they landed on Marcus, who was at the back, forgotten as always. In that instant, the general had the expression of a desperate man. 10 American jets had been dispatched, but they were already at a disadvantage. The enemies did not follow patterns. Their movements were erratic, aggressive, almost as if they knew every American maneuver before it happened. 2 American fighters had already fired all their guided missiles. Nothing had worked. The artificial intelligence systems that promised certain victory were leaving questions without answers. The general approached Marcus with desperation in his eyes. In that moment, in a fraction of a second, Marcus understood that his life was about to change. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because someone finally had realized that machines could not win everything. Sometimes you needed something much older, much more dangerous, much more human. Intuition. Marcus entered the command room like a resurrected ghost. General Harlow grabbed him by the arm. "You know old combat trajectories. These enemies are flying like nobody we've ever faced. Can I try something?" Marcus did not hesitate. He approached the monitoring screens, and his gaze swept across the flight patterns of the 10 enemy jets. The young analysts around him whispered among themselves. Who was that old man? Why was the general calling a living archive to solve a cutting-edge technology problem? Captain Chun approached with a skeptical expression. "With all respect, Colonel, our AI algorithms have already analyzed every move. These fighters are using a formation that our models predict as impossible. The data does not make sense." Marcus barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on the trajectories. He saw something that the machines did not see. Those 10 enemies were not random. There was rhythm there. There was breath. There was humanity, and Marcus knew humanity in combat. "Wait," he said, pointing at the screen. "Look at this pattern here, here, and here. They are repeating. It is not obvious because the repetition is spaced at irregular intervals, but it is there." Chen typed quickly. The data appeared. The colonel was right. There was a pattern. A code. "This is a mirror," continued Marcus, his voice gaining authority that few remembered he possessed. "A human pilot does this when trying to disguise his true attack pattern. It is a technique I learned from a Russian instructor in 1985. Very rare. Very effective. Except if you know what to look for." The general leaned forward. "And now? How do our pilots win?" Marcus breathed deeply. He knew that what he would say next would be interpreted in two ways: as genius or as madness. That lead pilot is making a mistake. A mistake that only another experienced pilot can see. He is synchronizing the movements of the other 9 jets with a specific radio command. If we cut that frequency, if we block it, the other 9 fighters will be left without coordination. They will become easy targets. Chun crossed his arms. This has never been tested in a real scenario. We could damage the base's own communication systems. Exactly, answered Marcus with a bitter smile. That is why nobody tries. That is why you have already lost 2 fighters. Because you are thinking like machines. These pilots are thinking like warriors. The general looked at Marcus, then at Chun, then back at Marcus. The decision was his. Either let a forgotten man attempt the impossible, or allow 10 enemy fighters to destroy Nellis. "Do it," said the general. Now, Marcus felt the weight of 30 years of insignificance disappear from his shoulders. He was no longer the man nobody wanted. He was the only one who could save that base, and everyone knew it. Marcus moved with the precision of a surgeon. His hands, despite his age, typed commands with a speed that surprised even Chun. The base's communication technicians received direct orders. Isolate frequency 127.4 MHz, create a directed jamming block, and do it in less than 90 seconds. General Harlow watched every move, his eyes fixed on the radar screens. The 10 enemies continued their deadly dance with the American fighters. But now the Americans were receiving different instructions. Orders that defied every modern engagement protocol. When Marcus finished typing the final sequence, he turned to the general. "It is done. But it only works if our pilots trust. If they hesitate, if they doubt, that jamming frequency will only give us seconds, not minutes." The general breathed deeply and picked up the radio. "Fighter pilots, this is command. You are going to receive a sequence of maneuvers that will seem wrong. You are going to trust Colonel Reeves. Execute as instructed. Trust instinct." On the monitors, the trajectories of the American fighters began to change. It was not modern tactic. It was pure, primitive tactic, calculated over decades of aeronautical knowledge that lived only in the mind of men like Marcus. And then it happened. When the jamming went into action, the formation of the 10 enemy fighters collapsed. Without coordination, without the command of the lead pilot, they scattered like frightened birds. What was once a coordinated threat became chaos. The American fighters, following Marcus's instructions transmitted by the general, executed a series of maneuvers that put them at devastating advantage. In less than 2 minutes, 5 of the 10 enemy jets were shot down. The other 5 tried to escape, but it was already too late. They had no coordination. They had no leadership. They had only panic. 10 fighters destroyed. 0 American losses. When the last radar signal disappeared from the screens, silence took over the command room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. What had just happened had turned everything upside down. Marcus leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly. The general placed his hand on his shoulder. "You saved this base, Colonel." Marcus looked at the general, then at the empty screens, then at Chan, whose face was pale with shock. Now, the whole world would need to know that machines and algorithms were not enough. That experience, intuition, and human knowledge still had power. That a forgotten man had done what all of modern technology could not. And if you are also rooting for Marcus, take this moment and subscribe to the channel. The twist in this story is just beginning, and what comes next will change everything you know about aerial combat. The hours that followed were a blur of adrenaline and recognition. Marcus was taken to the general's conference room, where he found not only Harlow, but also Colonel Stevens, commander of air operations for the entire region, who had traveled from Washington on an emergency flight. "What you did today redefined our understanding of aerial warfare," said Stevens, shaking Marcus's hand with reverence. 10 enemies. 0 American losses. Our AI teams would take hours to do what you did in minutes. Marcus felt something he had not felt in decades. Importance. But it was not an empty feeling of ego. It was weight. Responsibility. Because now everyone wanted to know his secret. In the days that followed, Marcus was summoned for debriefings with intelligence officers. Generals wanted to understand him. Data scientists came to observe him work, trying to translate his intuition into algorithms. Captain Chen, who had ignored him before, now followed him like a shadow, asking for explanations, wanting to learn. "Colonel, how did you know that pattern was a mirror?" Marcus sat down next to Chen in a break room, drinking coffee that was finally hot. "Because one day a Russian pilot tried to do exactly that to me. I was in a combat simulator in 1985, and my instructor, a man named Dmitry, was flying against me. He repeated the pattern 4 times before I realized it. After that, I never forgot. Memory is not just data. It is experience. It is being alive in a moment and letting that moment live in you." Chun typed something in his notebook. "We are creating a mentorship program. Would you teach the younger pilots? Not just tactics, but instinct. Would you teach?" Marcus hesitated. For 30 years, no one had asked him to teach. Now, they were asking him to pass on his entire life. "Yes," he answered simply. A week later, Marcus was in a combat simulator, for the first time in 15 years. Young pilots, with bright eyes of curiosity and confidence, wanted to learn from the fossil. But now he was not a fossil. He was a teacher. He was a legend again, but different, not for what he shot down in the past, but for what he could build in the present. During training, Marcus taught the pilots not just maneuvers, but how to read humanity in combat. How to understand that every action has a human reaction behind it. How the perfect machine can be defeated by a man who still thinks like a man. And then, in a simulator, one of the youngest pilots, Lieutenant Sarah Winters, executed the maneuver perfectly. Not like an algorithm, like a thinking, intuitive, alive human being. Marcus smiled. That was true victory. Not destroying enemies. It was creating better human beings. 3 months later, Marcus received an official letter. It was not a dismissal. It was a promotion. Director of Research and Development Tactics at Nellis Air Force Base, with a restored salary and benefits that would allow him to live with dignity again. The letter was signed by the Secretary of the Air Force himself. But material recognition was only part of the story. The true resolution came in ways that no diploma or salary could measure. Chun, who had once ignored him, became his most dedicated assistant, creating algorithms that blended artificial intelligence with Marcus's ancient tactical principles. Together, they developed a new training system that would be distributed to every American base. Machines and humans finally working in harmony. General Harlow invited him to dinner at his house, something that had never happened before. His wife prepared grilled fish, and they talked about life, family, and the meaning of second chances. Marcus spoke of his deceased wife, of how he wished she could have seen that day. Harlow placed his hand on his shoulder and said that she was seeing it. Somehow. But the most profound moment came when Marcus received a letter from an unknown soldier at a base in South Korea. The pilot had been trained under the new program Marcus developed and managed to defeat a superior enemy in combat, using exactly the principles Marcus taught. Nobody died. The mission was successful. And it was all because a forgotten man decided to share what he knew. "Colonel Reeves, I read that you shot down 10 jets in one day. But I discovered that you saved much more than that. You saved men like me. Thank you for being alive." Marcus read that letter 3 times. His hands trembled. The pain he had carried for 30 years, the pain of being irrelevant, of being forgotten, of being discarded, finally began to heal. In the corridors of the base, pilots no longer called him Fossil. They called him Colonel, Sir, Master. But more importantly, they called him friend. One morning, as Marcus walked along the runway, he saw Lieutenant Winters executing a maneuver that he himself had invented 50 years ago. She flew with grace, with freedom, with the instinct that no manual could teach. When she landed and removed her helmet, Her face shone with satisfaction. "Colonel, I did it. Exactly as you taught me." Marcus smiled, and in that smile was contained all the peace a man could find. It was not about victory over enemies. It was about victory over himself. It was about transforming insignificance into legacy. It was about discovering that it is never too late to matter. Humiliation had transformed into honor. Pain had transformed into purpose. And Marcus Reeves, the man that time had forgotten, had finally found his place again. 5 years later, May 2029, Marcus Reeves, now 68 years old, walked through the corridors of Nellis Air Force Base wearing a uniform he had never imagined wearing again. It was no longer a combat uniform. It was a ceremonial one. Today was his last day before final retirement. But this time, it would be a chosen retirement, honored, surrounded by respect. The conference room was packed, not just with military personnel, but with pilots he had trained, officers he had advised, people whose lives he had touched in ways he could never have foreseen. General Harlow was there with even grayer hair. Chen, now a major, was presenting a series of awards and recognitions Marcus had received over the years. And there were younger faces too, a new generation of pilots raised under his teachings. The President of the United States had sent a personal letter, read aloud by General Stevens. In it, he recognized Marcus not only as a military hero, but as a pioneer in a new model of tactical education that had saved hundreds of American lives and those of allies. But what really mattered to Marcus were seated in the front row. His children. Both had come from their distant states. His eldest son, David, now a history professor, had brought his 3 grandchildren. His daughter, Patricia, a doctor in Boston, had come with her entire family. They embraced him as if Marcus had finally returned from a very long war. After the official ceremony, there was a cocktail in the main hangar. Marcus circulated among the guests, and in each conversation, he saw the reflection of his legacy. A young pilot described how he had saved his life during a mission using a maneuver Marcus had taught him. An intelligence officer talked about how the program merging AI and human intuition had revolutionized global military strategy. A journalist documented everything for a book that would be released about Marcus's life. At the end of the night, when the crowd had diminished, Marcus walked alone to the runway. The Nevada desert sky shone with stars. He breathed in deeply the dry, hot air he had known for so long. A familiar voice called to him. It was Lieutenant Winters, now captain, with the insignia of an elite pilot. "Colonel, I just wanted to say that everything I am as a pilot I owe to you. Not just the techniques. The courage to believe in myself when machines said it was impossible." Marcus hugged her, and in that embrace was the continuation of everything he had built. His legacy was not just tactical. It was human. It was about restoring faith that experience, wisdom, and intuition still had value in a world increasingly automatic. That night, when Marcus got home, he opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for years. A French wine that his wife loved. He sat on the porch with a photo of her by his side and whispered words that only she could hear. "I did it, my love. Finally, I found my way back." And in the stars of the Nevada desert, somewhere that transcends time and space, a woman who had left 5 years ago could finally rest in peace, knowing that her man had found his purpose again.